First, though, something a bit more serious, closer to home. There is a crisis brewing for families at risk of losing their homes in Oxfordshire. Councils across the county are now urging the government to help them, saying they're struggling to cope with the numbers of people needing housing. The cost of living crisis and record private rents, which have more than doubled in some cases in Oxford, are being blamed for this. So let's try and understand what's going on. Linda Smith is the Cabinet Member for Housing at Oxford City Council. Morning, Linda.
Good morning, Sophie. Thanks for inviting me on.
Is this just an Oxford problem, or is it something that everywhere in Oxfordshire is dealing with?
Well, it's somewhere that councils across the country are having to deal with. That's why we've signed this letter that's been organised by the District Councils Network, which represents district councils like us across the country. So we're one of 119 councils that have signed this letter, really setting out to the government what they need to do to support us, to get us through this crisis of their own making, really. So we've got unprecedented numbers of families presenting to the council as homeless at the moment, that's putting an unprecedented pressure on us. I mean, when families are threatened with homelessness in the way, obviously what we want to do is help them into long-term stable accommodation as soon as possible, but that isn't always possible, and that's very difficult in Oxford particularly because of the high cost of renting.
Can you give us an idea of the scale of this, Linda, of the problem? Like, do you know how many families you're helping at the moment?
Yeah. So typically, in recent years, we've had about 100 households or less in temporary accommodation. So these are families that we want to help solve their homelessness, find them a long-term home. We're not able to do that straight away, so we have to put them in temporary accommodation just to keep a roof over their heads. And we've got access to about 100 units of temporary accommodation for us to use in that way. At the moment, we've got over 200 families needing that kind of assistance from us. So we don't have those units of temporary accommodation available to us to put them in. And that means that the council is having, unfortunately, to rely on hotels in Oxford where we can find budget hotels that are available, but where they're not, we're having to go beyond the city boundaries, and unfortunately, some families we're having to put them up in High Wycombe, Swindon, Wheatley, Farringdon, and we know it's far from ideal.
It must be stressful
in terms of.
In terms of schools, jobs,
exactly.
If they can't afford a home, then obviously they're probably struggling with getting themselves from place to place as well. I mean, it all sort of links together, doesn't it?
Exactly. It's an expensive way to deal with this. But it's far from ideal for the families involved as well, especially if they've got kids that they need to get back into Oxford to go to school each day. And it's heartbreaking hearing some of those stories. So we want those where we do have to use that hotel accommodation. We want that stay to be as short as possible. So that's what we're asking for more help from the government to cover the costs to the council of that we're having at the moment, but also to help solve the problems, so to make it easier to help people into long-term accommodation, and that means more support for our programme of building affordable housing in Oxford, and changes to benefits as well, so that it's easier for people to afford rents in the private rented sector, because at the moment there's very little available for families to rent in Oxford that you can actually cover if you're on benefits, that you can actually afford if you're on benefits.
Well, the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Community says it's given councils £1 billion over 3 years to help them tackle homelessness. That sort of translates to 6.6 million for Oxfordshire. But as we know, numbers can sound really big. And then when it comes to actually sort of spreading them out, it's sort of you know better than most, I guess, Linda, what the actual budgets are and the actual costs of these things, particularly with hotels. I want to get a bit of advice as well. Pat Coomber-Wood from Citizens Advice North Oxfordshire is with us too. Morning, Pat.
Good morning.
Are you seeing an increase in families needing support too, or is this just an Oxford issue?
No, this is a much wider issue, and we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg at the moment because, certainly the council's already mentioned 200 people that they're helping, 200 families, but the reality is more families are coming to us worried about becoming potentially homeless because they're facing concerns around being in a negative budget. By the time they've paid off these raised rents, they've paid off, other essential bills, they've got no money left at the end of the month. And it's only going to get worse. If you're living in a negative budget every month where you're minus £100 or £200, the debt just grows, and eventually something has to give. And then what happens is they find themselves being evicted from their homes because they get into rent arrears.
And these no-fault evictions, Linda, can you explain a bit? People might not know sort of why they are important in this whole issue.
Yeah, so often the families that come to us that were in the private rented sector and are facing homelessness, it's because they have been evicted with one of these no-fault evictions from their property, the property they were living in. Sometimes it's that rents have increased, as has just been said, beyond what they can afford. So the government did promise back in 2019 to ban no-fault evictions, but we're still waiting for action on that. So that isn't something that's happened, but that would help. But what we also want people to do is we have refocused our homelessness support services and our housing needs services at the council to really focus on homelessness prevention. And, we do want people to come to us early. Don't wait until the last minute, until people are actually faced with eviction. If people are worried about homelessness, worried about being evicted, worried about not being able to pay the rent, then please make contact with the City Council as soon as possible, because there are things that we can do to try and assist. There are discretionary housing payments which can be made to support people to stay in their home while we work with them to try and maximise their income, whether that's through work or benefits. We can mediate with the landlord. We would far rather know about the situation early and step in to try and prevent homelessness rather than have to deal with it after it's occurred.
Absolutely. And often asking for help can be tough. I mean, Pat, I guess for you with Citizens Advice, maybe, people feel like calling up the council is a big step, a sort of a last resort. Citizens Advice can sort of maybe help you get your ducks in a row and way before you're at that point of contacting the council, although, as Linda says, you can contact them anytime if you are concerned. There are things that can be done,
Absolutely.
Pat, aren't there, to help?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the starting point, just start thinking about it as soon as you start worrying about it. Don't, kind of think, I'll deal with it later. Because, if people bury their head in the sand, which is it's a very natural thing to do when you're feeling under pressure or stressed and you don't know which way to turn, it just gets worse. It's not going to get better if you ignore it. So, you can go online and find really useful information on our website about what to do, really useful tools on the Citizens Advice website about how to plan what you might be entitled to. The reality is there might be things that you're entitled to, but you're not actually aware of. So go and have a look and start looking at that first. Start a conversation with us. Get in touch. We can start helping you to think about what the options are, and we encourage a lot of people to go to the council and speak to the council, because the council often is part of the solution when somebody is at risk of homelessness. And so from that point of view, there is support out there, but we have to be realistic as well. That for some people, the support isn't just a magic solution. It can be quite challenging, and for some people, their lives will be disrupted through this process because it is a crisis. And if we work together and support the council in what they're trying to do, the charities are also trying to get housing allowance increased, because housing allowance just doesn't cover the cost of rent at all. And when people are on low incomes, and particularly single parent families, it's impossible. They just get overwhelmed.
Yeah, it's great to speak to you both. Thank you. Good advice and good help. Pat Coomber-Wood from Citizens Advice North Oxfordshire, and Linda Smith, the Cabinet Member for Housing at Oxford City Council. As always, if you've got something to say on this, pick up the phone, 0808 100 9100. A spokesperson for the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities said we've given councils £1 billion over 3 years to help them tackle homelessness, including £6.6 million for Oxfordshire. But it does seem the need is increasing from what you're telling us this morning. Nathaniel Forrester is the Oxford field organiser at ACORN. Morning, Nathaniel.
Good morning.
Just explain what ACORN is for people who don't know.
Yeah, so ACORN, we're a community organisation. We aim to get people together to use our strength in numbers to get issues changed that are affecting our communities. And often this does mean housing issues. So, for example, we'll be resisting evictions, but also campaigning on a larger scale to get the government to change its laws to prevent them happening in the first place, that sort of thing.
And so we've heard from the City Council in Oxford that the amount of families they're dealing with has doubled. Citizens Advice North Oxfordshire told us they're seeing more people. What's the experience of ACORN? What are you hearing?
Yeah, I absolutely echoes that. I think almost every single day I speak to someone who is feeling like they're on the edge of being priced out of Oxford, or if not, they've already had their eviction notice. So it's just happening over and over again. Often families, and just hearing so many people say, "I don't know if I can afford to live in this city anymore." And that's not just people on incredibly low wage jobs. That's NHS workers, that's teachers as well.
Do you think it would surprise a lot of people that, this is the stage we're at now in the cost of living crisis, where people who are going out, earning all right, are in nowhere near able to make their money stretch to the basic things: housing, food, travel to and from work, things like that?
Yeah, it's absolutely astounding. And I think, we've seen all of the, unions fighting for better wages on one hand, which is absolutely essential. But yeah, we need something to change around housing. So that is why we're campaigning for a rent freeze and eviction ban in the short term, and in the longer term, we want an end to no fault evictions. Full stop.
And does that also affect, Nathaniel, presumably the quality of where people are having to live? If they're not able to stay where they want to, what kind of stuff are they dealing with in terms of if they're having to go and look for cheaper accommodation or accommodation further out?
I think the really dangerous situation is often when people have found themselves already in a situation where the housing is substandard. For example, I think there was a family that came to us with help for a terrible rat infestation. The landlord was really not treating it seriously. This was affecting their whole family's health, incredibly stressful, living with rats, and really, dangerous, some of the diseases you can catch from that. They're trying to manage school and just pay the rent, but they're also trying to fight to get their landlord to do these basic repairs to stop the rats coming in and things like that. But they've found they can't. They were looking for other places. They didn't want to stay in that situation. They were looking for other housing, but they couldn't find that. So which is why we ended up having to put so much pressure on the landlord just to sort the issue out. Because I think people would often move if they could, even though that's incredibly disruptive and shouldn't be the case in the first place. But yeah.
Wow, it's interesting to speak to you, Nathaniel. And I mean, how realistic is it that the councils, including many in Oxfordshire, want to meet the Chancellor ahead of tomorrow's autumn statement? I mean, he's got the statement coming up. He's quite busy. Is it realistic that things are going to be turned around quickly? You obviously campaign for stuff like this all the time.
Is it realistic? Well, they could do it. The people in power, they could do it. They could do it very quickly if they wanted to. A rent freeze and eviction ban would be a very easy thing to do. The renters reform bill is long overdue, which is why we're campaigning so hard on it now to make it stronger. We were promised it nearly 5 years ago, so these things could have been done already. I think there's just a lack of political will, which is where I think the sort of grassroots mobilising, where everyone needs to stand up and join with others to put a bit of pressure on the government and make them realise this is absolutely essential and needs to happen now.
Good to speak to you and quite eye-opening, I'm sure, for people listening this morning. That's Nathaniel Forrester from ACORN.
Sophie Law. BBC.